Chapter 4 New Year Resolutions If we did not have a white Christmas, we had a white New Year. Midway between the two came a heavy snowfall. It was winter in our orchard of old delights then, so truly winter that it was hard to believe summer had ever dwelt in it, or that spring would ever return to it. There were no birds to sing the music of the moon, and the path where the apple blossoms had fallen was heaped with less fragrant drifts. But it was a place of wonder on a moonlight night, when the snowy arcades shone like avenues of ivory and crystal, and the bare trees cast fairy-like traceries upon them. Over Uncle Stephen's Walk, where the snow had fallen smoothly, a spell of white magic had been woven. Taintless and wonderful it seemed, like a street of pearl in the New Jerusalem. On New Year's Eve we were all together in Uncle Alec's kitchen, which was tacitly given over to our revels during the winter evenings. The Story Girl and Peter were there, of course, and Sara Ray's mother had allowed her to come up on condition that she should be home by 8 sharp. Cecily was glad to see her, but the boys never hailed her arrival with overmuch delight, because, since the dark began to come down early, Aunt Janet always made one of us walk down home with her. We hated this because Sara Ray was always so maddeningly self-conscious of having an escort. We knew perfectly well that next day in school she would tell her chums as a dead secret that so-and-so King saw her home from the hill farm the night before. Now, seeing a young lady home from choice, and being sent home with her by your aunt or mother are two entirely different things, and we thought Sara Ray ought to have sense enough to know it. Outside there was a vivid rose of sunset behind the cold hills of fir, and the long reaches of snowy fields glowed fairily pink in the western light. The drifts along the edges of the meadows and down the lane looked as if a series of breaking waves had, by the lifting of a magician's wand, been suddenly transformed into marble, even to their toppling curls of foam. Slowly the splendor died, giving place to the mystic beauty of a winter twilight when the moon is rising. The hollow sky was a cup of blue, the stars came out over the white glens, and the earth was covered with a kingly carpet for the feet of the young ear to press. "I'm so glad the snow came," said the Story Girl. "If it hadn't, the New Year would have seemed just as dingy and worn out as the old. There's something very solemn about the idea of a New Year, isn't there? Just think of 365 whole days, with not a thing happened in them yet." "I don't suppose anything very wonderful will happen in them," said Felix pessimistically. To Felix, just then, life was flat, stale, and unprofitable because it was his turn to go home with Sara Ray. "It makes me a little frightened to think of all that may happen in them," said Cecily. "Miss Marwood says it is what we put into a year, not what we get out of it, that counts." "I'm always glad to see a new year," said the Story Girl. "I wish we could do as they do in Norway. The whole family sits up until midnight, and then, just as the clock is striking 12, the father opens the door and welcomes the new year in. Isn't it a pretty custom?" "If Ma would let us stay up till 12 we might do that too," said Dan, "but she never will. I call it mean." "If I ever have children I'll let them stay up to watch the new year in," said the Story Girl decidedly. "So will I," said Peter, "but other nights they'll have to go to bed at 7. "You ought to be ashamed, speaking of such things," said Felicity, with a scandalized face. Peter shrank into the background abashed, no doubt believing that he had broken some Family Guide precept all to pieces. "I didn't know it wasn't proper to mention children," he muttered apologetically. "We ought to make some New Year's resolutions," suggested the Story Girl. "New Year's Eve is the time to make them." "I can't think of any resolutions I want to make," said Felicity, who was perfectly satisfied with herself. "I could suggest a few to you," said Dan sarcastically. "There are so many that I would like to make," said Cecily, "that I'm afraid it wouldn't be any use trying to keep them all." "Well, let's all make a few, just for the fun of it, and see if we can keep them," I said, "and let's get paper and ink and write them out. That will make them seem more solemn and binding." "And then pin them up on our bedroom walls where we'll see them every day," suggested the Story Girl. "And every time we break a resolution we must put a cross opposite it. That will show us what progress we are making, as well as make us ashamed if we have too many crosses." "And let's have a roll of honor in our magazine," suggested Felix, "and every month we'll publish the names of those who keep their resolutions perfect." "I think it's all nonsense," said Felicity, but she joined our circle around the table, though she sat for a long time with a blank sheet before her. "Let's all make a resolution in turn," I said. "I'll lead off." And, recalling with shame certain unpleasant differences of opinion I had lately had with Felicity, I wrote down in my best hand, "I shall try to keep my temper always." "You'd better," said Felicity tactfully. It was Dan's turn next. "I can't think of anything to start with," he said, gnawing his pen holder fiercely. "You might make a resolution not to eat poison berries," suggested Felicity. "You'd better make one not to nag people everlastingly," retorted Dan. "Oh, don't quarrel the last night of the old year," implied Cecily. "You might resolve not to quarrel any time," suggested Sara Ray. "No, sir," said Dan emphatically. "There's no use making a resolution you can't keep. There are people in this family you've just got to quarrel with if you want to live. But I've thought of one. I won't do things to spite people." Felicity, who really was in an unbearable mood that night, laughed disagreeably, but Cecily gave her a fierce nudge, which probably restrained her from speaking. "I will not eat any apples," wrote Felix. "What on earth do you want to give up eating apples for?" asked Peter in astonishment. "Never mind," returned Felix. "Apples make people fat, you know," said Felicity sweetly. "It does seem a funny kind of resolution," I said doubtfully. "I think our resolutions ought to be giving up wrong things or doing right ones." "You make your resolutions to suit yourself, and I'll make mine to suit myself," said Felix defiantly. "I shall never get drunk," wrote Peter painstakingly. "But you never do," said the Story Girl in astonishment. "Well, it will be all the easier to keep the resolution," argued Peter. "That isn't fair," complained Dan. "If we all resolved not to do the things we never do, we'd all be on the roll of honor." "You let Peter alone," said Felicity severely. "It's a very good resolution and one everybody ought to make." "I shall not be jealous," wrote the Story Girl. "But are you?" I asked, surprised. The Story Girl colored and nodded. "Of one thing," she confessed, "but I'm not going to tell what it is." "I'm jealous sometimes too," confessed Sara Ray, "and so my first resolution will be, I shall try not to feel jealous when I hear the other girls in school describing all the sick spells they've had." "Goodness, do you want to be sick?" demanded Felix in astonishment. "It makes a person important," explained Sara Ray. "I'm going to try to improve my mind by reading good books and listening to older people," wrote Cecily. "You got that out of the Sunday school paper," cried Felicity. "It doesn't matter where I got it," said Cecily with dignity. "The main thing is to keep it." "It's your turn, Felicity," I said. Felicity tossed her beautiful golden head. "I told you I wasn't going to make any resolutions. Go on yourself." "I shall always study my grammar lesson," I wrote, I who loathed grammar with a deadly loathing. "I hate grammar too," sighed Sara Ray. "It seems so unimportant." Sara was rather fond of a big word, but did not always get hold of the right one. I rather suspected that in the above instance she really meant uninteresting. "I won't get mad at Felicity if I can help it," wrote Dan. "I'm sure I never do anything to make you mad," exclaimed Felicity. "I don't think it's polite to make resolutions about your sisters," said Peter. "He can't keep it anyway," scoffed Felicity. "He's got such an awful temper." "It's a family failing," flashed Dan, breaking his resolution ere the ink on it was dry. "There you go," taunted Felicity. "I'll work all my arithmetic problems without any help," scribbled Felix. "I wish I could resolve that too," sighed Sara Ray, "but it wouldn't be any use. I'd never be able to do those compound multiplication sums the teacher gives us to do